Okay, so as you can tell, I've added a material to the player. You can go ahead and grab any image off the internet you want and create a material and add this as the base map. I just searched for smiley face and then found there was one on Wikimedia's Commons. And this image, you see it has a black background here. If I select it, that's because and it doesn't really say anything here very much. But what this is this is a PNG file. And PNG files have alpha or transparent, or which is also known as transparency, right? So all these black pixels around the outside are actually transparent pixels. So this image would just be, hovering with a transparent background. Now, you'll note that when I apply it as on a material to my object, which I have named Bob material here, you'll notice that it is also black. And so it's like, well, how do I get that transparency to work? The way you do that is by changing your surface type. If the surface type is opaque, any pixels that are transparent, right, that have the alpha color being black, which is equivalent to transparent. White, when you're talking with alpha, is equivalent to opaque. So, right, the alpha of this image is white for everywhere the face is and black everywhere else. You can also have grays in there that are halfway transparent, but what you do is you change the surface type from opaque to transparent. As soon as you do that, you'll notice that I just have the shape outlined and the rest of the box disappears except for, you can see that this thing is repeated on all the faces, right? And this tells you something about how textures are applied as well to objects. And if I wanted to adjust where this face is, I can adjust the offset. So I can, scroll this in the X. I can scroll this in the Y. I can adjust the scale and everything too. But this is some of the limitations of just applying an image to a surface without having proper UV coordinates set up on your base object, which we're not going to talk about right now. But so you can leave it transparent. I'm going to leave it opaque just so I know where the edges of the boundaries of this thing are. And so let's go ahead and make some obstacles. So the obstacles are also going to be be impacted by this tile trigger. And again, we need them to be able to flow a lot like these road tiles do. So if I select one of the road tiles and I go to my flow graph, there's a lot of stuff here that I want to reuse, right? Specifically, if I'm not so worried about this scene variable, but I want to be able to, I want to use all of this. Now I could, it might be good to have a super unit that would that would house all of these things. But right now, I'm just going to select all of those units. I'm going to hit Command C or Control C to copy. I'm going to copy all of them. Then I'm going to go to road tiles. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create another empty object called obstacle generator. So it's not going to be a child. I'm just going to create an empty object. And this game object is going to be called, I'm just going to be lazy and call it OBS gen, obstacle generator, right? So I've got this obstacle generator, and then what I want to do is I want to, I'm going to start by, well, why don't we just use spheres? We'll use something that's, visually distinct from the object here. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure, that this is centered. So I'm just going to reset it to 0. And then I definitely want the Y to be at, at least 0.5. I'm going to do 0.6 again, just to get it lifted up a little bit above the surface. And then what I want to do is I want to make sure this, this obs generator also needs to be zeroed. So let's go ahead and reset that to 0. So it's dead center. And I'm going to make the sphere a child of the obstacle generator for the time being. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select the sphere. And I need to, not the name of the sphere, but we can name it. Let's just call it obstacle. And you'll see that a lot of these steps are similar to what we did previously. So it has a sphere collider, but I also know that I'm going to need a rigid body on there. So because it's going to be, it needs to be able to collide with that thing. It's going to be is kinematic. It's not going to use gravity for the time being. And so I've got my rigid body on there. And then I also am going to need a graph. So I'm just going to type in flow and select flow machine. And again, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make this a macro because this is also going to be turned into a thing. So I'm just going to call this, oops, hold on a second. I'm going to click new. And then in my assets under my scripts, wherever scripts went, I just blew right past it a couple of times. There we go. I'm going to save this as obs motion. And I'm going to hit save. And now I'm just going to go ahead and paste what I had in there. There we go. You have to click once to get the blue line over here so you know you're in here. Otherwise, it does not paste it. So if you ever get frustrated with that, that is why. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete that. I am going to delete this as well. And so something I do want to do, right, there's a couple changes we need to make here, right? It's alerting me that this does not exist, right? So we do need an object variable, and we're also going to, get this variable as well. So let's go ahead and create some variables for this. And so I'm going to make both. I'm just going to make this one an object variable, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to, oops, every single time. So I'm going to call this, I'm just going to call this obs speed. I'm going to hit plus. And to start with, let's make it a float, and let's leave it, it'll be at -10 as well, right? It's going to be going the same rate as the road, as though they are, standing still essentially as we go forward. So I've got my obs speed. Now, the way I'm doing these variables, eventually I may need to come through, if I want there to be power-ups where I go faster, I want the speed of everything to change at the same time. But we're just getting the basics set up, and then we can make those adjustments as needed to our scripts. So I've got this obs speed variable, and I don't need to set it in here right now. I'm gonna leave this object here, but I'm gonna disconnect it from everything. And I'm just going to run this flow back through here. And this is an object variable. I'm going to click on here, and I'm going to say obs speed is what I want. Okay, so I've got this object variable. I've got everything up here. Now, so let's go ahead and find a better Z position to start with for the time being. So to start with, I am going to just set this Z position to, let's just say 40. And then I'm going to go ahead and run this and just make sure that the graph works and that it moves through the scene. Okay, so it's moving through the scene now, you'll note, and it actually collided with that, but now it's just going to keep going on and on forever. Okay, so because that's going to go on and on and on forever, we need to make it stop when it hits that obstacle, or when it hits that collider. But before that, we need to be able to start generating things. Now, the only other thing I'd probably like to do here is add a material to this. So let's go ahead and create a material and add it to this object just so it makes it a little bit brighter. If I go to materials, which I need to just move all of these others too, I also have a lot of different materials. I might just go ahead and apply this ball material to it. So I've dropped in my ball material on here. It's just green. it'll show up on the screen. That's fantastic. So now what we need to do is we need to be able to generate these, and we need them to disappear when they hit the thing. So the last thing we want to do before we turn this into a prefab is we want to tag it. So, but let's go ahead and say we forgot to do the tag, because I want to show you how to fix that, or what the process is if you've done that and you don't go through and open the prefab. So if I go to project and go to assets, and then let's go to prefabs, wherever I put that folder, it's probably easier to find here. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and pull obstacle into my prefabs. So now I've done this, but I want to tag this, right? And so, you know, I have these different tags here, but I'm going to go ahead and add a new one. I'm just going to call it OBS. OBS. I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to go ahead and select this in the scene again, and go ahead and come down here and say OBS. Now, when I do that, you'll see that there's this overrides option here. If I click on this, you'll see that there's this option to update this. And what that does is it updates, it takes whatever I've done to this one instance of this object, and it applies it to all instances. Now, in this case, I only have one. But if I had, like, say, 20 of these obstacles and I forgot to tag them, then what I can do is I can click Apply All. And what it'll do is it'll apply the obstacle tag to all of the copies. Now, the other thing it probably did was it applied this Z being 40. So if I click on my prefab and click Open, right, now you can see that my position, if I select this, it's because it's in context. If I select it in my assets and click Open Prefab, then I can make additional changes, right? So you'll notice that if I select this here and I click Open, right, it's in context, and so it locks me out of doing certain changes. There's certain changes I can make, but just as a heads up, it really stops you from doing certain things. If you want to edit it at the base level, you select it in your assets and then click Open Prefab. Now, I have this set as the default. I really want, it's not really going to matter because we're going to update that as soon as this thing opens. Okay. So now we need to be able to generate these, right? And so what we're going to do is we are going to select this obstacle generator. We're going to click Add Component. We're going to make a flow machine, and we should let's go ahead and make this an embed, and we're going to call this flow machine obstacle generator. Okay, so we have named it, and now we can go to this flow graph and we can start working. And so what we want to do is we need to be able to generate a copy of this object, right? And so the command that does that, the unit, is if I click Add Unit and I type in the longest word in the whole history of words, it's not true, but instantiate, INST, should get us close. Well, that's int to string, but here we go, instantiate. Now, there's many, many different options that we can do. The one that we are probably going to want, because what we'd like to do, at least in the hierarchy, it's oftentimes nice if we can keep things more organized. And so obsgen is our parent object, and we'd like to be able to generate these as children of this obstacle. So if we click in this original parent option, you'll notice that we can actually set position and rotation when we generate these as well. But we are going to do something a little bit different. So I'm going to go ahead and click original and parent. And then we need to go ahead and get things started, because this will need a few things. So the parent is going to be the obsgen object. So we'll select that. It could also be, right, self should be an option. And if it's not, we can always type in self. And then the original is going to be our obstacle. So we go ahead and click on here, and we just type in OBS to start with, and scroll down, and there's our obstacle prefab. Okay, so we've got those two things added in there. So these should generate. Now, the other things that we're going to want to do is when we generate these, we do want to set our position. We don't need to set rotation. We want that to be randomized, and we only want these to generate at a certain rate. We don't want these to generate every single frame, or else we are going to have thousands and thousands of these objects rolling through the scene very, very quickly. So let's focus on instantiating a single object. So let's just go ahead and see what happens when we instantiate this, and then what we can do is we can right click over here, and we can say we can type in transform.position, and we're going to set the transform.position is what we want to do. The thing we want to use is this GameObject, and the other thing we need to do is we need to tell it where we want it to go. So to start with, let's just set it to, we're just going to hard code it to 30 in the Z and 3 in the Y and 0.6 in, or sorry, 0.6 in the Y and 3 in the X. All right, just so we have it offset a little bit, and we just get some sense of, is this working at all? And this should only happen once when the graph starts. It should create one and set it up. So I'm going to go ahead and hide this copy, and let's go ahead and see what happens when we generate this new one. Okay, so you saw the one that generated halfway through the floor. I don't know which one that was. But it should have created a second one. Let's go ahead and see if this creates this again. Now, what we'll look at is here to see if we get it. It doesn't look like it put it where I wanted it to go, but it did create this clone. And you'll see that it's actually doing everything correct, but when I come in here, you'll see that this new vector, it's actually resetting everything except like the Z is getting updated, and it's resetting the X and Y. Now that's going to be problematic, and we'll look at how to fix that in a second. But it's working. It did actually instantiate it. So let's go ahead and figure out some of our flaws in this. So I should actually save this now and then continue on. Okay, so the object generates when we start the scene, right? There's this, we have this one copy here that we have in our scene, which I can disappear, and I can actually uncheck it, so it's totally cut off from the world. But if I go ahead and run this, right, we will get one copy that should generate when the thing starts, right? So here's that copy that generated, and there it goes. But it's not where we put it. So when we start the scene, we have one copy that gets generated, and there it is, and it comes rolling through, but it does not have these values that we gave it in this transform. And so how are we going to fix that problem? So we need to pause it, and we need to figure out, okay, why, when I'm trying to set the transform over here, where is it, why is it that it's still being generated in the center of the world? It's being set to 0, 0, even though it's supposed to be set to 3 and 6. Now the 30 seems to be right and seems to be accurate, but everything else is wrong. So let's go and look at our obstacle and look at the graph that we have on the obstacle. So in our obstacle graph, and right, this is this isn't the one that was generated, but this is the base object, even though I have it all turned off right now. It's still relevant. So here we come through, and one of the first things we do is we get our position. But look at what we do. We only get the z value, the current z value, and then we do all of this add. And when we come over to this new vector 3, we put that new z value here, right, from the old one, plus or minus or whatever, the speed, and we come through here and we set this. And so it looks pretty innocuous at first, but when we create this new vector 3, right, we're not just sending the z value into the transform, we're sending the x and y values into the transform as well. And so every time this fixed update gets called, we're setting x back to 0 and y back to 0. And so that is conflicting. Okay, so if we come back to the generator, right, we set this once right at the start, but then as soon as that fixed update gets called, these values, this value is okay, but these values get set to 0. So we need to fix that in our obstacle. So I'm going to select the obstacle, and I'm going to go ahead and actually go to the project pane, select the obstacle here, and this is something I definitely want to change in every single copy, right? When one of these gets created, I want to be able to adjust it. So I'm going to open the prefab, I'm going to select the flow graph, and what I need to do is I need to get the x and y value as well, so that I can split those out and feed them back into this new vector. Right, that will solve it, because if I get whatever the current x and y values are as well, then they will stay whatever they were set when this thing starts. So let's go ahead and right click, and I'm going to say, vector 3 dot get, and as soon as I do that, just .g will get me to x, and then I can say, vector 3. And even if I just say vector 3y, right, it allows me to get that value as well. Now, there might be a more efficient way with less units to do this, and somebody could teach me, and that would be fantastic. But so let's go ahead and pull this into y, and and add a line to our x. And then these two just need to connect in to our vector 3. Right, this new vector 3 that we're generating in order to update this entire position. Now this is somewhere where this is something we do all the time, right? And so this would be a great use of a super unit where we set the x, y, and z of the transform. And so we just have these two units in here. And that way, instead of creating all of these over and over again, we can just use that one unit and feed these in here. And it might even make sense to be able to split these out inside that unit, feed them in here, and then feed this. But for now, we're just going to leave it with all the units out here, right? So now when I run this, it should be offset to one side as it comes through the scene. Let's go ahead and see what happens. And there we go, right? It's offset and it's staying where it's supposed to be in terms of the world. So that's fantastic. This is a great moment to save what we're doing. And let's go ahead and pop out of our obstacle and select the generator again. Okay, so we've got the generator selected and we are able to set this. Now what we need to do is we need to be able to generate a random position for each one of these for every time this is run. And so to generate that random position, and really we want the the z and the x or the y to remain the same, and it's really just the x position, right? We just want it to be randomly generated at 30 units away, or maybe even further, but for now 30 units, somewhere in the roadway. And we know the roadway, if we look at the position of our left and right boundaries, we know that the roadway is, maybe about 5 units across. Like it's -5 to that very far edge, and it's +5 to that very far edge. But when I set this to 3, it was still on the road itself. And so maybe we want this to go from -4 to 4. So how do we do that? There's this great unit called random range. And so if I type in random, there's random range, and there's two versions of it. There's one that's a float and one that's an int, right? And so what that means is the minimum and maximum basically say, I want a random number to be generated between these two boundaries, between, let's say, -4 for the minimum and 4 for the maximum, right? And the only difference between these two is one of them will give you, right, values with a decimal point. The float will give you anything between those numbers, and the int version will only give you, whole numbers. And in our case, whole numbers should be fine. I don't know if one of them is more efficient than the other, but I'm going to use the one that does ints, right? So in this case, it's the second one down, because I don't need it to be that finely detailed. It'd be better to have them appear in standard places, although maybe having a floating point number might be better in certain cases. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by running my flow through here, and then I am going to set the minimum to -4. I'm going to set the maximum to 4. And these are hard-coded, right? We could always add variables to be able to adjust these values, but we're pretty set. This is, we're laying this thing out. We're just going to leave it the way it is. And so the other thing that we're going to need to do, right, is again, like always, we're going to need to create a vector3 so that we can add this value in here. So I'm going to right-click. I'm going to say add unit. I'm going to say new vector, and that'll be new vector3. And you'll see that I have the option, the XYZ option. That's what I want. Now, when I do this, I'm going to need to have this flow go through here. However, right, what we learned in our previous one, if I just connect the Z and leave the other two open, then this is going to be problematic. And so what I should do is either hard code in here where I want these to be, because this is the first time that this is happening, and it's only going to happen once. It'd be fine for me to hard code these. So I know I want this to be 0.6 off the y-axis. And then let's go ahead and set these to 50 in the x. So before we were doing, oh, sorry, I have totally messed this up. Let's disconnect this. This is going to be completely wrong. Let's put, this should be the x value, not the z value, and then the z value should be 50. Right, so before we were doing 30, but in this case, we're just going to set it to 50. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the flow from here to here and take the flow into there. Okay, so these values, oh, sorry, somehow I missed. There we go. Now we're right. Okay, so, right, so I've got my x value being set somewhere between -4 and 4. And then y is constantly 0.6 and z is 50. And this should set off this object. Now, the question is going to be, let's make sure that this works. And the question is going to be is how do we get more of these? So let's see what happens. Okay, so right, it's not at 3 anymore, it's at negative something. If I select it, I can find out. If I open this up, I should have this obstacle clone. That means that it's one that was made with the instantiate model object. And you can see that -4 was the x position, right? And this thing just keeps going further and further away. So we need to make sure it collides. And then we also need to have it, and then we also need to figure out how to make more copies. So we've got our one, so let's go ahead and start by trying to make more copies, and then we will figure out how to get rid of those copies when they are no longer useful to us. So the first thing we need to do, right, we've got our object, and we're instantiating it. So we want to do this, and we want to do this in a timed manner, right? We want maybe once per second a new object to come to the screen, or once every half a second, or maybe it's something we want to have vary based on difficulty, right? If they've been driving down the road for a while, maybe as time goes by, we want the frequency of objects being created to increase. So how do we do that? The first step is going to be to use a timer. So we're going to click on Add Unit, and we just want to type in timer. And if we select this, you'll see that this has a lot of different possible settings. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in as much as I can, and then zoom my screen for you all for just a second so we can see this a little bit better. Okay, and maybe I'll move this up here so it's just easier to see. Okay, so the timer has several options. There's all sorts of flows that come in, and then all sorts of values that we can get out and values we can put in. The most important ones are start, started, completed, and duration. Duration is in seconds. So this is every second, right? Once we hit, what happens is the start condition, the flow comes into start. This timer is ticking down for a second, and then it shoots out a sit message here. You can always look at how much is elapsed or remaining. There's a lot of useful things in there. But there's some other things here that are important too. It tells us when it started, it tells us when it's completed, and there's this tick option. Now we don't need this. If I select this and scroll over here a little bit, right? It has pretty good descriptions of what each of these things do, right? And so in this case, we're going to be using start, we're going to be using duration, we're going to be using started, and we're going to be using completed, right? Because what we're going to do is we want when update happens, we want this to shoot in here and start this process. And then once it's started, we want to instantiate the object. So we're going to shoot this out here. When it's completed, we want it to start again. And so we're going to look at how to get that loop to happen, right? Because we just want this timer to count down and then pop back up and then count down and pop back up and so on and so forth. So I am going to zoom in as much as I can on this, and we'll get started. Okay, so the first thing, let's continue to use the start event and just see how this works, and we'll learn a little bit about these things in the process. So to start with, if I just say start and then started, right? So now when this starts, it's gonna come in here, and immediately it's going to send out a message and create an obstacle. And then at some point it's going to be completed. So let's see if I can just send this completed back to the start. It's not letting me do that, right? I cannot send a message from the end of one unit back into itself. So I'm going to need a way to figure out what to do when this is completed. Now, there's another unit, and this was from a tutorial by a YouTuber whose name on YouTube is Home Mech, and he doesn't have many tutorials, but they're really awesome, and I highly suggest you look at them. And as he releases more, he's really good at explaining things. It's a solid person, so I'm going to give him some props for this. So I'm going to go to Add Unit, and the unit I want is called Once. And what Once does is, surprisingly enough, it does something once. And so what we need to do is we need to we need a couple things to make this happen. First, so we know what we want to do when we start this, right? When the timer starts, we want to create an object, and then we want to wait until the timer starts again. And so this completed sends out a message when the thing is done. And so we're going to come in here, and we're going to put this in the input. So it's going to send out a message here, and then this once we're going to bring down to start. And so what happens is now at the start of the game, this should fire in here. It will do this action. When this is completed, it's going to come up here, which is going to send out another pulse back into start and start our timer again. Now, why do we want to do this? There's another thing we need to do as well, which is we need to select the start event, check mark Coroutine. Now, what this means is that rather than waiting for all of this action to complete, which will essentially never complete because it's going to keep cycling through, what it means is that we can do other things, right? This is going to be happening sort of on its own little clock, doing its thing in the background, and it just is going to, it works a lot better. So coroutine, whenever you're doing something where you're generating multiple copies or timing actions, you want to be able to set that as a coroutine, right? It just means it's happening in parallel with other things, and you don't need to worry about waiting for the process to complete before this something else happens. So let's see if this works. We've added a lot of units. Let's see if we haven't broken something. Okay, so it happened once, right? It didn't happen all the times we would have liked it to happen. It just fired off that one, and then it created a second copy, but it still needs some additional input in order for this to work. So let's go ahead and pause this and see what we need to do. So start isn't going to do it for us. What we need to do is, instead of using start, we need to attach this to update. And so if we attach this to update and checkmark coroutine and delete this and add this here, we should now get something that works a little bit better, unless I've really messed it up. Okay, so I did this wrong, didn't I? Look at how many copies we're getting, right? What's awesome is we're getting a lot of copies. What's not awesome is that we're getting a lot of copies. So let's go ahead and stop this and see where we've made this mistake again. So, right, so I have this running into the start here, and that's not really going to help us out, is it? Right? Because that means it's just constantly starting this timer, right? Where we really want this to run into is into our, right, into our flow here. And right, and so we're sort of, what's the best way to describe this? We're sort of bumbling our way through this, which is really how you're going to learn how to use these units and how you're gonna work. There's a lot of bumbling. So right, so what's happening now is I know that this isn't what I want either. It's going to be sending a ton of messages in here, and so I've messed up something in here. And maybe it's that I'm using update instead of start, or maybe I do need start. So let's go ahead and I'm going to create start again, just so we can have it. I do want to make that a coroutine just in case. And so I've messed up my connections here somewhere. So what once does, and having this connected to update is really going to show us what happens, right? So if I run this, right, you notice that there was one little ball that rolled up from completed, but there's all of these balls going in here and there's nothing coming through here. So why is that? And that's because the way that this unit once works is it does something once. And so it doesn't matter how many pulses are coming in through this port. As soon as it's gotten that first pulse, it ignores everything else until it gets a reset signal. Right? And so that's where I made the mistake, right? I connected this up to the start rather than to the reset. And so let's go ahead and we're going to do this live so we can see the difference here. So I'm going to disconnect that so there's no flow whatsoever. I am going to go ahead and disconnect the completed wire. I'm going to run completed into reset like I think it should be done. And you'll note this is turning yellow because I have no flow coming in. And then I'm going to go ahead and have this start event come in here. Now, this should have saved. So let's see if it saved or if it changes back to what we had before. All right, it changed back to what we had before, even though it's not supposed to do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and right-click here to disconnect both of those wires. And we'll just reconnect everything. So completed is going to go to reset, and this arrow here is going to go to the start event. Okay, so we've got that set. So let's go ahead and see if this will allow it to trigger continuously. Okay. In this case, we only got one copy that went through. So let's go ahead and switch this to reset. Okay, so now you can see I'm getting a whole bunch of inputs in here, but I'm getting this once a second output. And so now my clones are being generated in a sane quantity across this. Now, if I go ahead and change this duration, if I make this 0.5, right, I should be getting a lot more clones that are being generated. Now, something else, I'm going to go ahead and not stop this, but pause it. I want to show you how many clones I've got right now, right? I've got a ton of clones, and soon I'm going to have many, many, many more. If I let too many clones form, there's a good chance that Unity is going to crash. And so we want to make sure that we do not let these things hang out and continue to clutter our space. We only want them on alive while they're useful to us, right? Where, once they've passed the player and once they're out of the shot, we don't need them anymore. And so what we're going to do is, let's go ahead and right click on this start and delete it. And then now that we've done that, let's go ahead and we can unpause it, and then let's go ahead and stop this. And and of course it jumped back to what we had before, so let's go ahead and just delete start. Let's go ahead and update, put our update in there. Okay. So, and I had this set to half a second, but right now I'm not too worried about it. We could go ahead, and it might be great to make an object variable at this point that we can change the duration with. So I'm going to go ahead and create something called, this is on the obs generator, so we'll call this, I'm going to call this obs time, which is basically how long do we want this, how long between clones. And so I'm going to go ahead and we'll just say, we'll leave it at 1 second for right now. And then once we have that created, I'm going to just pull this down, and I'm going to go ahead and set the duration to that. Okay, so that's one change that'll make it a lot easier to adjust how quickly these clones come out. And the other thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to modify our tile trigger in order to collect and destroy our clones once we've passed them. So once they've passed. So I'm going to select the tile trigger. I'm going to come down here, and this is where this branch is going to become useful, right? So what I need to do is I need to basically redo this, these set of steps. And there's several different ways we could do that, but we're going to go with the simplest to understand visually. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, GameObject, I know I need to compare the tag. I know I'm going to need to branch and do something if this is true. I don't want to reset these to where they started. I want to get rid of them. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste these two tags. I'm going to pull this down here to the collider. And I'm going to move this over a little bit. And then we'll need to create a new variable for the tag that we're going to be comparing, and we'll do that in a second. But what we're going to do is we're going to split this off to false, so that when this, right, so it's going to check to see if this is a tile. And then if it's not a tile, then it's going to come and it's going to check to see what the heck has collided with it. And then we're going to do something to that, right? And so let's go ahead and create a new variable. And that new variable, instead of tile, let's just call this, we'll just call it obstacle. Or we'll call it, how about obs tag? There we go, because that's what it is. It's going to be a tag. And we could probably change that to tile tag, but I'm going to call it obs tag. It's going to be a string. And the value for that, let's just say, I think I created the tag OBS for that. I'm going to set that as it is, and I'm going to double check. I'm going to select my obstacle here, and yes, OBS is the tag that I created. So I'm going to go back to my tile trigger. I've got OBS here. So I'm going to go ahead and just select this get variable, copy and paste it, and then connect this to my tag, and then just click on this little drop down arrow and grab the obs tag variable, which should have the value of obs. Okay, so now that I've got this connected, now we need to say, okay, what do I want to do to this object when the collision occurs? What I need to do is I need to right click and say add unit, and just, I could either type in GameObject destroy or just destroy. And once I do that, I can say object destroy, and we're not going to worry about time at all. We're just going to destroy it. So I'm going to select that. And the object here, I want to make sure that I pull this all the way over from that collider, right? Because this is the object that's collided with the trigger, right? With the tile trigger. If I leave that where it is, what happens is it will destroy the trigger itself, and then the tiles, the road tile, everything will break. And so I just want to do this if it's true. Okay. And so I'm going to go out a little bit further so I can actually see the tile trigger. There it is. So I want to make sure that objects disappear when they get here. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. Okay, so I've got a bunch of objects generating, and let's see what happens when they hit that thing. Okay, so they are currently flying right through it, and they are not being seen. So what is going on? Something is not right. Let's figure out what's wrong. Okay, so what's going wrong? If you remember back to one of our first tutorial where we were talking about colliders, remember that what this gives you is the collider that's attached to your object. So what we're getting in this case, if I select the obstacle, is we're not getting the game object, right? We're just getting the sphere collider that's on the obstacle. And so if I have, so if I go ahead and run this again, we'll see what happens when we select one of these obstacles that it's created as a clone. So I'm going to go ahead and select this very first clone. And I want you to watch what happens here in the inspector when it hits that. Did you see that? Right? You can pause it and go back if you want. But what happened is the sphere collider was destroyed. Right? It wasn't the game object itself, it was the sphere collider. So what we need to do is we need to fix that. Right? And so to fix that, we can right click and say type in collider.get, and we should be able to, oh, sorry, collider.GameObject is what we want. There we go. So we want to say collider.GameObject will get us there fastest. And what this is going to do, right, is it's going to give us the, rather than giving us the collider that is attached to our obstacle, it's actually going to give us the obstacle game object, and then we can destroy that obstacle, right? So for these compare tags, it doesn't really matter because the tag is attached to the collider and it can figure out, what that tag is, but it can't. But if we're just telling it to destroy the collider, that's not going to be good enough. So we want to make sure we put this in here and then run this over here to destroy. Okay, so let's see if this works now. Okay, so they're coming down the line, and let's see if they start getting destroyed. Here we go. Right? So as these hit this collider, they are disappearing. In this way, we only have, maybe 10 or 12 copies on the screen at any given time. And we aren't piling up a bunch of unused objects just off screen somewhere, right? So we're keeping a very limited number. And it just means that it's that much less that our that any device that we put this on has to keep track of, right? And you may not notice, on a laptop or a desktop, you may not notice if you've got like, 1,000 clones of something, any difference in performance. But if you're on if you're playing a game on a mobile device or something, those are going to add up really quickly. So, all right, so we've created a random unit generator, right? And at this point, there's no consequences for hitting these. They just push you out of the way. And there's no power-ups or anything either. And so for the next tutorial, we'll look at basically duplicating this, so we're not just dealing with obstacles, but maybe some power-ups as well. And we'll see how that works. So join me for the next one.